Good afternoon, and in fact morning for some of you. Welcome to Alpha Sigma News Lunch and Learn. Today, it happens to be ASN Day, a day of promoting awareness of Alpha Sigma Nu, celebrated particularly by our student chapters and alumni clubs, and we invite all our members to participate on social media. It is most appropriate that today's speaker is Joan Rosenhauer, as Joan's work and life really reflect the values of Alpha Sigma Nu. Joan is the executive director of the Jesuit Refugee Service USA, where she leads the organization's efforts in the United States, particularly, to fulfill its mission to accompany, serve, and advocate for refugees and displaced persons. As a member of JRS's global senior leadership team, she also helps JRS's global operations, and she's a former JRS USA board member. Joan's resume is both inspirational and aspirational, as she has spent most of her career advocating for social justice and mobilizing the U.S. Catholic community to do the same. She served as executive vice president of Catholic Relief Services, leading the organization's outreach, advocacy, marketing, and communications, and at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, where she worked with the bishops on documents on Catholic social teaching. Joan has a bachelor's degree in social work from the University of Iowa and a master's degree in public policy management from the University of Maryland. And she's received honorary doctorates from Dominican College, St. Ambrose University, and Georgetown University. Joan will entertain questions after her presentation, so feel free to use the question or chat features to pose your questions. Joan, thanks so much again for being with us. We're delighted to have you and look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be a part of this, and in part honored because I understand we had a really good turnout today, and that delights me because I know it's not because everybody knows me, but I think it's because everybody really cares about refugees. They saw Jesuit Refugee Service, and it's a topic that they care about and want to hear about, and that's so encouraging to me because it's something that we work on all the time to lift up the crisis facing refugees around the world. But, and just as an example, not too long ago, I was in Chad and I was visiting some of our programs in Eastern Chad. And since then, typically when I speak to an audience in the US now, I will ask them, how many of you remember, and for some of our audience, maybe you were quite young at this point, but about 15 years ago, there was a genocide in Darfur, and that's the western part of Sudan. And it was all over the news feed. It was all, everybody was talking about it, in part because it was after the genocide in Rwanda, and people had said, we will never let that happen again. And now they were watching on cable news, watching a genocide occur. What I typically ask people is, how many of you have thought about those people from Darfur who were fleeing the genocide? Because the news cycle moved on. We're not paying attention. We all moved on. But those people are still in Eastern Chad, living in refugee camps, living in grass huts, trying to make a life for themselves after the horror that they experienced. Most people don't focus on refugees like the ones from Darfur who are now living in Chad, but the fact that you signed up for this means that you are interested, that you are paying attention, that you haven't forgotten about the crisis of refugees around the world. So thank you for being here and for inviting me to be a speaker. I want to do basically three things. First, to give a little background on the refugee crisis in the world, and I'm sure this will not be entirely new information for many of you, but it is worth focusing on and reminding ourselves of because it is significant. Secondly, I'll talk a little bit about JRS and our strategy for responding to the needs of displaced people around the world, and some of the priorities that we've set and why we've set them. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about what we can all do here in the US. Everybody can do something. We can't all work overseas. We can't all, respond in all different kinds of ways, but every one of us can do something. And so I'll lay out a few somethings that we can all be involved in. So let me see if I can share my screen here. as you may know, we currently have, the largest crisis of people displaced from their homes in recorded history. The most recent information from the United Nations, from UNHCR, indicate that 70.8, almost 71 million people have been forcibly displaced worldwide. That includes 41.3 million internally displaced people, 25.9 million refugees, and 3.5 million asylum seekers. And one thing I want to note is that these are official categories that people can fall into, but there's a lot of unofficial situations where people are not technically IDPs, they're not technically refugees, they're not technically asylum seekers, they haven't formally applied for asylum. And so that number of nearly 71 million really is much, much higher, and we don't even know how many people it is. Let me just say a word about those categories. And again, this will be a repetition for some of you, but refugees are people who have a legitimate fear of some kind of persecution based on several key categories. Let me pull that up so I make sure that actually, I think I have it in let me go through one more slide and then I'll get to that. So these are a few more figures from UNHCR, and you'll see that 3.9 million people are stateless. This would be this category that doesn't have an official designation, but they acknowledge that millions and millions more exist than that, but there's just no way to identify how many there are. There are 37 million people a day forced to flee their homes. That's another number I want to pull out here. There are a lot of interesting statistics here, but 37 million people today. That means that every minute, 30 people flee their homes. So just in the time that we are talking today, how many people are going to flee their homes? 37,000 people, sorry, I think I said million, but 37,000 people every day flee their homes and try to find a place to go. So just to give you a sense of who they are, 60% of refugees, and again, this is officially refugees. JRS serves all displaced people, whether they have an official category or not, but among refugees, 60% live in urban areas. Less than 1% of refugees were resettled to a country like the US last year, and that has major implications for our strategy in reaching out to refugees. And as you may know, the US has reduced the refugee admissions that we accept from an average, one statistic I saw said 80,000 per year. Others say it was more in the 95,000 per year. I know several years ago, we were hoping it would get up over 120,000. It is now down to 18,000. The most recent presidential determination for FY20, it will allow 18,000 only refugees into the United States. So that's a drastic drop, and means that the options for people who have official refugee status are much limited, let alone the ones who don't have official refugee status. More than half of all refugees are children. More than half of all refugee children are not in schools, and refugee children are 5 times more likely to be out of school than non-refugee children. 61% of refugee children have access to primary school. In many, many countries around the world, it's much higher, more like 90% or nearly 100%. 23% have access to secondary school, and only 1% have access to higher education, to tertiary education. This means that we have to pay attention to this. The world can't forget all of these displaced people. And there's a reason for that, or several reasons. One is that the crisis is huge, that 70.8 million people is a higher population than all but 10 of the countries in the world. Out of 195 countries in the world, only 10 have a greater population than the population of people who have no country, who have no home, who are refugees. Another reason that this is critical for us not to forget is that we know what's going on. We see what's going on every day on the news. We can't pretend, maybe 200 years ago, we could have pretended that that was an issue for another part of the world, but not our issue. Today, it's our issue because we know what is going on, and the world is so connected globally that we're all a part of the problem and a part of the solution. Another reason that this is so critical, that it led me to really want to focus on this particular issue, the issue of displaced people, is that point that I had just made, that half of them are children. And these children are incredibly traumatized by whatever it was that led them to flee their home. There's no child in the world that gets picked up by their parents and starts trudging across land and then in boats and on sea and whatnot, who does not experience some kind of trauma in their lives. And this picture here that we see on the screen gives you a sense of that. A picture from kids. It's not right when you give little kids crayons and what they draw is bombs being dropped from the sky and people being killed and guns and things like that. I mean, it's a frightening thought. I don't know how we can expect, if we don't respond, if we don't help these refugee families, and especially the children in the families, how can we expect that 25 years from now, we will have a more just and peaceful world? We won't, because we're not attending to the crisis that is facing these children. I want to focus on one particular dimension of this. So we're aware that, and the picture there that the child drew, that was a child from Syria. We're aware of the situations where there's violence, and Boko Haram and in Nigeria and other parts of Africa, and the war in Syria and the war in Iraq. And we know that there are a lot of situations of violence and war that are causing people to flee, the Rohingya and the way they are being treated. What we may not pay so much attention to is the crisis of climate change and the impact of climate change. According to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the UN Refugee Agency, floods, storms, wildfires, and extreme temperatures have led to an annual average of 21.5 million people displaced since 2008, an annual average. At any given point, that's how many people. By those kinds of weather-related disasters. By 2050, nearly 250 million people, they are predicting, will be displaced by changes in the global climate. And we have seen a lot of that in the work that various relief and development agencies do. There was a study by CRS, by Catholic Relief Services, that indicated that a lot of the movement of rural families from the Northern Triangle and from other parts of Central America up to the north into Mexico and to the US was encouraged by the fact that they couldn't grow their crops anymore, that coffee farmers can't grow their crops anymore because the climate, the weather is getting too hot. It's causing, there was several years ago, a crisis of coffee leaf rust, a disease for coffee, but that is caused by consistently high temperatures. People can't move where their land is. So they have to be helped to grow an alternative crop, but many times they don't have access to those resources. They abandon their land and they head north and try to find another source of livelihoods. And another point that I think is important is that one of the challenges we face is that climate change is often a threat multiplier. So different challenges that cause people to flee their homes kind of occur in connection with each other. A key example is Syria, where a 5-year drought preceded the war. And a quote from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres indicates, and I'm quoting, "Climate change is now found to be the key factor accelerating all other drivers of forced displacement." He goes on to say, "These persons are not truly migrants in the sense that they did not move voluntarily. As forcibly displaced, not covered by the refugee protection regime, they find themselves in a legal void." So not only is this an important factor in the reality of displacement, but I think it's important to understand the real challenges facing people in this situation, because they do not qualify for a designation as a refugee. So here's where I'll go into a little bit of what does that mean. So a refugee is someone fleeing war or persecution who has crossed an international border and who has a well-founded fear of being persecuted because of his or her race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Obviously, one of the challenges with people fleeing climate crises and weather crises, whether it's a fast onset weather crisis, a tsunami or something like that, or a more slow onset, a long-term drought due to increased temperatures. Clearly, that person is not leaving because they're fearing persecution. There is no persecution involved there. So automatically, they don't qualify as a refugee, and they are not covered by the protections under the refugee legal regime. Many of them are internally displaced. So we talked about before the IDPs, the internally displaced people. They are also not protected as a refugee. It depends on the laws of their local nation, what kinds of protection and what kinds of help they get. There are also asylum seekers who are people who meet the qualifications of a refugee and are applying rather than applying to be a refugee and then being resettled. And so going through the whole system outside of the country where they want to be resettled, an asylum seeker has to meet those qualifications, but then is either in the country or presents themselves at the border or at a port of entry and applies for asylum. So again, there are these different categories. I want to say JRS responds to everybody who's been displaced, no matter what the situation. But in addition to those three kind of official categories, there are all kinds of unofficial situations where people really don't fall into any of those categories. So I want to say a little bit about how JRS responds. This is just a little picture of Jesuit Refugee Service. And the first thing I want to highlight is at the bottom of the screen, you'll see our tagline: accompany, serve, and advocate. And I want to highlight accompany. I think you can figure out, we'll talk more about, there are many ways that we serve refugees and then we advocate as well. I'll say more about that. But I want to say a word about accompany because accompaniment is a really central part of the culture of JRS, which has been interesting to me as I've joined JRS. I joined JRS a year and a half ago. And it's really important. I have been really impressed by the extent to which JRS staff all over the world are constantly challenging themselves to think about how are they accompanying, how are they walking with, how are they partnering, and really getting to know the refugees they're working with. So it's not enough for us to satisfy a target and to measure certain metrics and say we have delivered a certain amount of food, or we have done whatever it is, a certain amount of mosquito nets or whatever. For us, the challenge is, have we done this in a way that not only honors the humanity of the people we're working with and really brings them into the program and into the system, helping each other, but also really attends to what their greatest needs are, because we know them, we understand them. So I just want to lift up accompaniment. One of the ways that plays out is in many parts of the world, we have what we call home visitors. And those are refugees themselves who may not be allowed to have a formal job, but they can volunteer. And in some cases in the Middle East and Jordan and Lebanon, they can get a small stipend as a volunteer. And they go out and they visit refugees who have come to, especially in the urban centers in Amman or in Beirut, and they'll visit them in their homes. And I've done that with them. And the excitement that people have when these friends are coming to meet with them, even if there's nothing substantial they can do to change the situation. They're not able to get folks resettled, immediately, or they can't meet every medical need that the family has or whatever. But just having someone honoring their humanity by saying, you're important to us, and we want to know you, and we want to listen to you, and we want to sit beside you and listen to your story, even if we can't answer everything. So accompaniment is an important part of JRS. A little bit of history. We were founded in 1980 by the then Father General of the Jesuits, Pedro Arrupe. Some of you, it's a great thing. And he was responding to Vietnamese boat people and basically said, we just have to respond. I am sure he would be shocked to learn that all these years later, next year will be our 40th anniversary, we are not just responding to one country and one crisis, but 56 countries, more than 56 crises really, all over in every part of the world. And we do serve people in all those areas, regardless of religion or race or ethnicity. And that includes the fact that many of our staff are people of different religious backgrounds and obviously of a whole range of ethnicities and nationalities, et cetera, and races and things like that. I had an interesting experience when I was in Lebanon and Jordan, because I met the two country directors there, and the regional director is a Jesuit. But the country director that I met there in Jordan is a Muslim woman, and the country director in Lebanon is a Druze woman. So we really have a wonderful mixture of the richness of the different cultures and religions of the world, and we think that's a reflection of our identity as a Catholic and Jesuit agency. Just a little bit of about 2018. In 2018, we served just over 677,000 people, again, in 56 countries. We also launched a new strategy, and that strategy focuses on 4 priorities: reconciliation, education, livelihoods, and advocacy. And I want to say a word about each of those, because this is really our best thinking about how to respond to the current reality facing displaced people around the world. So reconciliation, what do we mean by that? It's basically the idea of helping people to be at peace with oneself and at peace with others. The reality, and you'll see the definition down there also, it talks about recreating right relationships. So right relationships, you know, at a very personal level, and then more broadly at a communal level. One of the things we always look at is the relationship between refugees or displaced people, IDPs, whoever they are, and the host community, because that is a critical relationship that has to be developed and nurtured. But also being at peace with oneself, as we saw from that picture that the child had drawn. People come into the situation of being displaced with incredible experience of trauma, and we can't you know, kind of move forward and think if we just get them shelter and we just get them food, everything's going to be fine. No, that is at the heart of their experience as human beings, and we have to respond to it. So this idea of reconciliation, we often call it psychosocial support. This is something that people sometimes think can wait. You know, first you have to get water and food and shelter and things like that, and that is all true. But reconciliation, psychosocial support cannot wait, because you know, the trauma that people have been through leads to deep-seated challenges for them in terms of their psychosocial health, their mental health, and so it's critical to respond to that. I once saw didn't mean to quite move just yet. I once saw a study that said that in Syria, among children who have experienced the war in Syria, 60% suffer from depression, and 40% suffer from full-blown PTSD. Now, you know, maybe different studies would show slightly different numbers, but it gives you a sense of the magnitude of the crisis that you know, we're facing among these children, that we have to respond to if we have any hope for a strong future. So the next thing, so we have this kind of foundation of helping people to get beyond the challenges, the psychosocial challenges, and the challenges in terms of relationships and the new community and the relationship between the host community and the refugee community or the displaced people's community. So we have that foundation, and then we move on to education. There are other groups that focus, and we do sometimes provide shelter and food and things like that. But coming out of a Jesuit tradition, you all are aware that Jesuits have a lot of experience in education, and that became the thing that we really wanted to focus on, because it is like psychosocial support. People may think that education is something you can get to later after you've got shelter and things like that. But the reality is that refugee and displaced children are often out of school for very long periods of time before they even get to a place where they're settled. And that has a long-term effect on them. So we need to get them in school as quickly as possible and get them back on track. And it also creates a sense of hope and safety for them. Going to school every day is a structured experience in a chaotic life. And it implies hope that if, people think I need an education, there's a future for me where I will need that education, and I can have hope for that future, even if the current situation is very difficult. So at JRS, we focus on education, early childhood, primary, secondary, post-secondary, and I'll say a word about that because that's very tied to livelihoods, which is the next area of our strategy, and then finally higher education. And in 2018, we served 237,000 people in education. So livelihoods is another critical dimension of our strategy, because the sad reality is that many people who have been displaced are displaced for many, many years. It used to be that you would think about displaced people, about refugees, about asylum seekers, and you would think, well, if we can help them get kind of some skills and so that they're ready to be resettled in Germany or France or the US or Australia or Canada or something like that, we'll be in good shape. The reality is they're not being resettled. They are staying where they are. And there are people who have been in camps as well as in, unofficial urban situations for decades, for 20 years, for 25 years. So we have to really think about how do we help them build their lives where they are and not count on being resettled into another country. So the first thing that we do with our livelihoods programs is make sure they're market-based. We do labor assessments and market assessments so that we know in a given camp what are the kinds of jobs that can be supported. Everywhere you go, people need midwives. Everywhere you go, people need tailors. Everywhere you go, people need hairdressers. Everywhere you go, those kinds of things are needed. And so we need, but the reason the study is so important, the market-based study is so important, is that there's not an unlimited number of hairdressers that can be supported in a given setting. So you can't just keep churning out hairdressers endlessly and think that there's going to be a market for them. So we have to have a really clear understanding of what the market will support and then train people for that. Other things we train people for are being teachers, especially early childhood educators, but even teachers. Some people come to their displaced setting where they are settling with some skills and with some education, and they can become teachers and things. Another example would be plumbers, because in camps all over the world, there are INGOs like JRS running water and sanitation programs, and they need people with basic plumbing skills to help them maintain their systems and run those programs and things. So you see the kind of focus we have to figure out how do we help people develop skills that will allow them to build a life for themselves and support their families where they are, not just with an eye toward being resettled. Another example is just giving them entrepreneurial skills so that they can start a little business and actually have a positive cash flow and be able to plan and manage all of that in a way that is successful and they can support their families. So whether it's a little, almost like a convenience store, but on a cart, with shampoos and soaps and things like that people need, or, other little businesses, bakeries and things like that. They need the skills to run a business successfully so that it doesn't fail. I want to say a word about digital. This is very exciting. In a camp that has been around for 15 to 18 years in Malawi, we're starting a program that is training young people in basic digital skills. So some of them, well, they're all really learning the basic Microsoft Office suite, but they're also learning, some of them learning coding. And we're working with a nonprofit in France. So not only will they get the training, but they will be able to actually engage in commerce and get jobs, get contracts, and carry out the entire contractual arrangement, deliver the product, and do it all digitally with companies in France who need people who can do things, using different, digital technologies. So that's very exciting. It's a challenge because Wi-Fi access is really hard in these places, but we're powering through that and trying to figure it out, because I think that's the future, that maybe these refugees who are going to be displaced for decades just have to skip over the local economy where they may not be allowed by the government to kind of fully engage, and just go straight to the kind of digital economy, the global digital economy. The last point I have on this is mentoring, because one of the things we've learned is you can't give people skills and say, okay, go find a job. I hope it works for you. They've been through enough. They may not have enough experience without solid mentoring. So that's a critical part of all of our livelihoods programs. And then the last thing I want to lift up is our advocacy, which is the fourth part of our, it's a part of our tagline, but it's the fourth part of our strategy. And so we try to support refugee voices globally, wherever they are. It can be dicey because in some countries, advocacy is not welcomed. And so we certainly don't want people to be imprisoned because we encourage them to do advocacy. But in some places, you can work with the refugees and with the local community and work with the government then to help them establish certain kinds of programming, maybe through the Ministry of Health, or we work with the Ministry of Education to connect the curriculum that is the local curriculum with the curriculum for refugees or refugees in a camp, for example, or just changing the laws about whether refugees can engage in a local, can get a job legally, or whether they can open a bank account and things like that. So a lot of that kind of very specific advocacy, and then of course advocacy in the U.S. And we're really excited. We've been working for a long time on trying to encourage the U.S. government to support something called Education Cannot Wait, which is a fund that helps provide education in emergencies in a really rapid. I said before, you can't hold off on education for several years. They've probably been out of school for several years already. So Education Cannot Wait gets education for people in crisis, including many displaced people, very quickly. And the U.S. had not contributed. It's a multilateral fund, global fund, but the U.S. had not contributed for several years. And there was just approval for a $21 million contribution for 2019. And then both the House and Senate State and Foreign Operations Committees included in their appropriations bills $25 million for 2020. So that gives you a sense of the kind of advocacy we do in the US. And so let me just go on to doing one thing. Everybody can do something. And so I want to share with you a few things that you can do. We always lift up, I guess my picture covers it up, but we always, the idea of share. The narrative about refugees is so inaccurate. It's so negative, and about displaced people of all kinds and migrants and everybody. The people I have met are some of the most amazing, resilient people. I could tell you stories all afternoon about these amazing people and how they build a community, build a life for themselves in the most difficult situations, continue to be kind to each other and committed to the common good, and also hopeful for themselves and for their neighbors and things. It's remarkable who they are, and those stories have to be shared so that we change the narrative from a negative one about migrants and refugees to one that is positive. And you can go on our website and find all kinds of refugees, and on our Twitter feed and things like that. I hope you'll follow us if you're not already. I just want to say we have an interesting program. It's kind of a, here we go. It's kind of a kind of small step, but it means a lot to refugees. So it's called Any Refugee. You can write to any refugee. And I'm holding up here, if you can see, some postcards that have been written by people in the US for refugees. And we literally take these with us and bring them to refugees around the world. And I did this not too long ago and brought it to some students, young adult students who were learning English. And they were so happy to get these postcards. And then this was in Eastern Chad, and the schools we were running in Eastern Chad. They were so happy to get these postcards and practicing their English. It was a great way. They were passing them all around, everybody practicing their English and stuff. So don't think that it doesn't matter to write just a simple postcard. It's a big deal for them, and it's wonderful to see. And so I hope you'll think about organizing a Write to Any Refugee effort on your campus or in whatever your setting is. Please sign up for our advocacy network. We are always sending out action alerts and giving you information about when and how you can advocate with members of Congress and with the administration on issues related to displaced people. So I hope you'll join us. We do have an advocacy day in Washington every April, and we haven't set the date just yet, but if you sign up, you'll get the first notice of it if you sign up for our advocacy list. And that's great fun. If you have any chance of coming to Washington in April, please come and join us, and we'll have a great time on Capitol Hill meeting with our members of Congress all over Capitol Hill. And then, oops, oh, right. Okay, then experience. You can host a Walk a Mile in My Shoes refugee simulation on your campus or in any other setting where people kind of have the experience of the disappointments and frustrations and challenges and things that refugees experience. It's a really well done thing. A lot of colleges have done this. So I hope if you are in a position to be able to help organize something like that, that would be terrific. And then lead, we have something called refugee action teams that have been formed on campuses. And we can certainly, if you get in touch with us or go to that website there, our outreach team, you can find out if there's one on your campus. Join it, please, if there is one on your campus. And if there isn't, maybe you'll decide to be a leader to create one. And we have a toolkit and tells you everything you need to know. It's very simple, and but helps to build that network across the country of people who are committed to displaced people around the world. Volunteer, you can look for a local. We don't do resettlement in the US, so we don't have those local offices, but you can look at a Catholic Charities or other agency that does resettlement and see if you can help in some ways there. We're resettling so few people now in the US, that's a little bit harder, but you may be able to find a way that you can help. And then we always can use fundraising if you want to organize some kind of fundraiser with your family at Christmas time or another holiday for whatever your faith tradition is. You know, that's a great thing to do. And I'll just give you a sense. We have a lot of opportunities. This was our back to school campaign, but people could raise, as little as $10 makes a difference because students in other parts of the world get the supplies they need. You know, here back to school is a big thing. In other parts of the world, students may not have an opportunity to get supplies unless we make sure that they have them. So it gives you a sense of like what we can do with raising small amounts like that. So that gives you a sense of kind of the current, sad situation as it relates to the magnitude of the refugee and displaced people reality. It gives you a sense of the strategy that JRS is using to try to respond to that and trying to be creative and really deal with the tough realities that exist around the world. And then a little bit of what you can do. And I would be happy to open up to questions or any comments that you would want to make. And I'll stop my...
Thank you so much, Joan. What a wonderful presentation. And I'm Amy O'Neill. I'm the Director of Development and Alumni Relations here at Alpha Sigma Nu. One of the questions, while people are hopefully typing, that we had is how does JRS, the United States JRS, interact with the global Jesuit refugee services movement?
Sure. Yeah. Well, there are a couple of ways, and we, as a part of the leadership team, we are very much a part of making the decisions, developing the strategy, things like that. But we also try to provide both fundraising resources. And so one of the ways that JRS is able to support our education programs and other things is through the funding from the State Department, through the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. And that money all comes through JRS USA, and then we work with our colleagues around the world in the different countries and the different programs. And we work with them both just because that money would come from the US. We work on developing the proposals and generating it and then getting the money out to them, but also making sure that they have support to have the kind of HR systems and finance systems and program monitoring and evaluation systems and things that they would need to carry out those programs in the best possible way. So we do that, and then just try to provide any other support we can around the world where our partners need it. I thought you were going to ask what we do in the US, and I haven't really said a word about that, but we have one program. We're actually looking at launching a new program, and so I'll have more information a year from now or 6 months from now about that. But the one program that we offer is we provide chaplains in 5 detention centers where people are being detained by the US government. And, a complicated job. I often think about my colleagues who do that and go there every day. They are really committed to supporting the people being detained by the US government. Those folks are often in a lot of crisis, and they're coming and going quickly, and they don't know what's going to happen next to them. And so, you know, the starting point is to make sure they have a way to practice their faith, whatever it is. We support people, you know, provide masses for Catholics, of course, but other Christians, Hindus, Muslims, Jewish people, people of all faith traditions, because they turn to their faith often when they're in that kind of crisis situation. But we also provide psychosocial support for them, as I discussed earlier. You know, people who have been through the process of fleeing their home have been through a lot of challenges in terms of their mental health, and so we try to provide some support for them.
Wonderful. I do have a question from Molly Johnson. She said, you mentioned that the anticipation of more refugees and migrants due to climate change. And oh wait, just somebody else had a question. Here's one away. There we go. What are some policy solutions to accommodate this issue? Are there any other interventions you see to prepare for this?
Well, yes, obviously anything we can do to, you know, mitigate the impact that we have on the climate, and so globally to, you know, to be a part of a global effort to reduce the impact we're having on the climate and the challenges that that's going to bring for all of us, I think is important. So if you look at, there are any number of policies that would address that. And then as it relates to the people who are kind of struggling the most already and the impact it has on them, there are you know, funds for adaptation so that they can learn to grow different crops, more drought-resistant crops and things like that. And there are budgetary decisions being made about how the U.S. supports those funds that are, and I'm blanking on the name of it now because I hadn't pulled that up recently, but you certainly can look online about, or, you know, get in touch with me. I can give you more information, but there are definitely policy decisions that we either do or do not support adaptation by people who are being hit by climate change, and disaster risk reduction programs in places that are going to be hit by major storms in ways that they hadn't in the past. But those programs have to be funded, and for us in the U.S., the way to make sure that happens is through the U.S. foreign aid budget and weighing in on those decisions.
Okay, I have another question from Emily on cultural competency for refugees from different areas. She's saying in her area, the Congolese refugees have experienced miscommunication and cultural insensitivity due to miseducation, that all Congolese people get along or speak the same language. Any advice for her on this?
Well, I think you raise a really good point. I think this question of it's part of why I think the idea of accompaniment is so important. I hope I'm getting at what your question is, but I think people here in the U.S. really have to understand and honor the humanity of the people who are coming here, and even the differences within a given community and things like that, so that we can create a context in which people can thrive and can get to know each other and can become a part of the solution, and shaping their own future and their own destiny and things. So I think part of it is that sometimes you know, we don't create the context in which people are really encouraged and nurtured to share their cultural you know, priorities and the challenges that they're facing in a new culture, or the challenges they're facing with other groups that are being resettled and things. And I think we just have to really attend to that. And that's a matter of prioritizing accompaniment and really attending to people's needs. I don't know if that's the answer to your question, if I understood it correctly, but at least that's one thought.
I'm going. So, Joan, Kate again. I'm going to ask a question that we got from Mike Canaris from Loyola Chicago, and because I think it also reflects a question I have. A lot of our chapters have done Walk a Mile in My Shoes, and I'm particularly excited to share with them the postcard idea, because I think that's a very easy done in a day project for our chapters. But Mike asks, he's a professor at Loyola Chicago and teaches classes that involve theologies of migration. He teaches at the Rome Center each June. He'd like to connect or involve our students with JRL offices or hands-on work being done there. So just so you know, and if you want to comment now or we can connect you later, but I thought maybe I'd give you the opportunity to comment now.
Great. Yeah, thank you for doing, first of all, for the groups that have done Walk a Mile in My Shoes. That's fantastic. I think that, I mean, the goal of all of this is both to increase our kind of empathy and understanding, and even writing postcards. You imagine a person that you're reaching out to, and I think that helps with that process. But also it's an awareness raising thing. So the more people that are involved, the more they become aware of the humanity of the people who are fleeing their homes and how they're making choices that are difficult, and that I've had one mother comes to mind in particular in Guatemala that I was meeting with, who had sent her 17-year-old daughter and was awaiting her return. She had been sent back through Mexico, but she was waiting her daughter's return. And I said, it must have been really hard to send your daughter. I have a daughter. I know how hard it would be to send her on this really dangerous path, up through Mexico on this trip. And she said, the gangs in our town said they would take her as a gang wife. What would you do? And I know exactly what I would do. I would do exactly what she did, and I understand the people who are arriving because of that experience. So I think doing those things that help people to understand and to identify people as human beings just like us, who would, and where we would make many of the same choices, I think is critical. On the question of connecting, I mean, if you're in Rome, I hope you'll connect with JRS, our Rome office for sure, because they would love to make a connection with you. Other parts of the country, and even here in the US, we're hoping that when we start our new domestic program here in the US, that it will include an element of having volunteers come and help out. And so, stay tuned on that. Keep an eye on our website for that. And then in other countries, we do have periodically internships where people can do shorter or longer term internships with our programs around the world. I mean, honestly, we have an entire world of students who would like to do that. So the demand is much greater than the supply of internship slots. But please don't hesitate to keep an eye on that and get in touch with us for those who are interested.
Great. I have two more questions I'm hoping you have time to answer. One is actually from a Jesuit, I happen to know this person. And he's asking, how, if at all, will the universal apostolic preferences impact JRS's efforts and collaborations with members in our Ignatian family?
Well, great, thank you. Actually, we have been talking a lot about the universal apostolic preferences lately, and we are at JRS USA just developing our strategic framework to align with the global strategic framework, which I told you about, the 4 priorities. And at the start of it is acknowledging the importance of the UAPs as a direction for us, and especially the one about walking with people on the margins. I'm not going to say it as eloquently as it actually does in the document, but so I think, that's where we really focus. I think there's an element of climate. There's an element of, walking with people on the margins. There's an element of youth, because again, more than half of all displaced people are children, are young people and children. And that's an area of particular concern if we want to build a brighter future for these families and for the young people. So I think the UAPs really, kind of align with what's important for JRS, and will give us direction and affirm the direction that we have been taking.
Hi, it's me again. Okay, here's one last question, unless anybody else has any. Are there any volunteer opportunities within your organization for working with people being detained by the U.S. government at the U.S. border, or even if this is done remotely?
Yes, at this time, we don't have a way for people to volunteer. This is something that we're definitely wanting to build into our new domestic program as we look at that. The restrictions on even digitally, connecting with people in detention, in the detention centers, but especially being there physically are very strict. So our staff have to go through, and you have to go through a full security clearance and everything. So our staff have to go through a lot to get approved to then go in and serve as chaplains and supporters for the detainees in those programs. So we cannot just, there's a little bit of, people can sometimes go to a religious service and just be there for the religious service, but that's at a very small scale. Because they just don't allow a lot of people in to the people being detained. Now, the one thing is that people aren't being detained for very long because they're being sent back to Mexico right now. I mean, the people along the border, especially, we have work in detention centers in upstate New York and in Miami as well, but a lot of the work is along the border, and with the Remain in Mexico policy, people are just being sent back to the other side of the border. So part of what we're working on is a program that would connect JRS USA and JRS Mexico in responding to that situation with migrants and displaced people at the border right now. That's mostly on the Mexico side because that's the policy of our government to send people back immediately.
Joan, one question I just thought of, other than your website, what other websites or news sources do you recommend to help people keep up with the news that I know some of these global issues may not always get the headline. So are there good resources that you suggest that we follow in order to get up to date and accurate information about the refugee crisis?
Boy, I wish I had thought about that, because I think the problem is that even in some ways our news cycle has been so consumed, even some of the international news cycle has been so consumed by politics that the stories of the reality elsewhere just doesn't get told very much. So I hesitate to say what is a really good source of kind of consistent longer stories about what the reality is in different countries and how the experiences that people have. I wish I had a great answer to that. I just don't. Sorry.
Sorry to stump you right at the end, huh?
Yeah.
Well, if you think of any, we can, you can just send them to me and we can post them on our website.
Good.
Good. That would work. So I think that comes to the end of our questions, which is great. And I absolutely want to thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your wisdom and knowledge. I think that I find when I'm interacting with our student members, and I know Amy feels the same way about our alumni members, this is an issue they're very interested in and would like, and we're so happy that you were available to be able to share your time and to help them learn more about the refugee crisis. I have to laugh at myself a little bit. Alpha Sigma Nu Day is in fact tomorrow. We had an Alpha Sigma Nu Day yesterday at Marquette, and so I was jumping the gun. So if you're still looking to share, particularly our alumni members, to share, you can use hashtag Alpha Sigma Nu or hashtag Jesuit Educated to share info or just your enthusiasm on social media. And also, Joan, one of the fun things we do is sometimes our faculty advisors will sign up for these webinars, and then chapter members gather at one spot. So I'm just going to give a shout out to any chapters who are out there watching. So I think with that, I thank you again, and thank everybody who jumped onto the webinar, and we'll announce soon who will be our spring speaker, and look forward to seeing you back then. Thanks again, Joan.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.